So, good afternoon, everybody. We will continue on the lecture about international migration. And I stopped in the previous class on this topic about development and migration. I just want to show you in the course website, like for the previous lectures on internal migration, I had there some material for those statistical software that you can use to estimate migration rates. And we had the interview with William Frey.
My apologies. It should be wrapping up in about 5 minutes.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you. And with demographer William Frey that I mentioned to you, and I summarized one of the slides. And for international migration, a lot of the lecture here actually included material outside of the textbook. You don't have to read all these papers that I put here in these two compressed files. It's a lot of material, but it's just for you to see when I will talk about the economic effects of immigration in these slides, and also about the US citizenship question and whether the southern border wall would work. All these topics that I included in the lecture are based on a series of readings, a series of articles. And if you want, you can have access to them here. The questions in the exams, you don't have to read these extra readings, of course. It's more based on the material that I summarized in the lecture, and also based on the textbook. But it's all here if you want to download these two compressed files that have several different articles there. And this is a short interview. It's 9 minute long with Professor Mushfiq Mubarak about whether immigration has negative effects or not on labor market outcomes. And in this short interview, he pretty much summarizes that it does not have negative effects. Actually, immigration is good for the economy, and we're going to discuss this in the lecture as well. And mostly because immigrants, they might take low-paying jobs that US-born people don't want to take it, and then US-born people, they take better jobs, and they actually have an upward mobility in their career. And in this long interview with Professor Esther Duflo, she was the 2019 Nobel Prize winning economist, and in a portion of this interview here, she also mentions that low-skilled immigration does not have a negative effect in the country. And so this is the material that's available in our course website, as you know it. So I will just continue on the lecture now. And as you see there, my camera is not working. Let's see if it might start working anytime here, according to the technician. And so far, I can see the chat. So if you have questions, you can ask in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and talk. So development, economic development, and migration are really related, associated to each other. But they are different, like in different theories, they know about this association, but even theories that understand migration in different ways, they have some commonalities as well. So just going back to some of these theories that we discussed in previous classes, in previous chapter, mostly in the chapter about theories of demography, the structuralist theory criticized the functionalist theory because the functionalist theory assumes socioeconomic forces tend towards equilibrium through migration. So the neoclassical, the push and pull factors theory, which is more based on rational people, individuals, making rational decisions of moving from one area to the other in order to improve their socioeconomic well-being. In that theory, so I guess you can see me now In that theory, the main assumption is that if you have areas with a lot of unemployment, people will get out of these areas and go to areas that have more job opportunities. And that will tend to create an equilibrium in terms of job opportunities around the country or across countries as well. And technically, people would keep moving from one place to the other until you reach this equilibrium in which different areas, different countries in the world have same opportunities for people. Thinking that people would have similar chances to move from across countries and also have knowledge about job opportunities in other countries. So the functionalist theory, as we discussed before, it's really based on the individual choices of rational actors deciding to migrate. The structuralist theory also considers some individual factors, but also includes a discussion, a more aggregate discussion about the general patterns of disruptions, dislocations, and migrations intrinsic to the capitalist system. So in the structuralist theory, also known as the new Marxist or the center periphery theory, you have some more rich countries and less developed countries or poor countries, and you tend to have migration from poor countries to rich countries exactly because you have all this unequal system or unequal opportunities for people throughout the world because as a result of the capitalist system. So the functionalist theory emphasizes more individual actors deciding to migrate, and the structuralist theory emphasizes that actually people are influenced by this overall way in which the world is organized in this capitalist society. So even with these different approaches, these two theoretical frameworks, they do share some assumptions. They do have some similar assumptions about the association between development and migration. Both of them, they take as an assumption to their assumptions, pretty much what they take it for granted, what they assume as being true before they even analyze the data, is that more economic development in a specific country leads to less immigration. When you reach really high levels of economic development, people will find job opportunities in the country where they live, so they will tend to get out of those countries with fewer chances, with lower chances. And higher development differences across areas leads to more migration. So in the language of the functionalist theory, if there is less equilibrium across countries in terms of job opportunities, that will tend to more migration between countries. And if you have, in the language of the structuralist theory, if you have more inequality caused by the capitalist society across countries, some more developed than others, that will also be a major factor influence international migration. So they both take these two aspects as the basis of their analysis as being true. And that association between development and migration can be summarized in this graph here. So the first thing that we talked before, countries with higher levels of development, those that have like really, really low levels of development, really poor countries, those people don't actually even have the means, money, resources to move from one country to the other because they're so poor that they cannot move from one country to the other. They don't have knowledge about moving to another country. They don't have money to pay for transportation. So their chances of getting out of those countries are really low. When these countries start to increase their economic development and get a little bit more a mid-development level, then people start to get some more money and they get more knowledge about possibilities to work in other countries, and they tend to have higher chances of getting out of their countries of origin, right? But as those countries keep developing even more and getting more job opportunities, more opportunities for these people, then the chances of these people getting out of those countries start to decrease because they will prefer to stay where they are, where they can find good job opportunities. And on the other hand, countries with low levels of development attract few immigrants, so not many people want to move to countries that have low levels of economic development or socioeconomic development. But as socioeconomic development increases, those countries start to attract a lot of immigrants. So that's the case of the US, of being a really well-developed society, attracts a lot of immigrants. You still have immigration, but fewer people overall leaving the US than entering the US, okay? And just some overall trends here in terms of international migration in the world. This is data from 2000 and 2013. And in 2013, more than 50% of the international migrants in the world resided in just these 10 countries here. 36, yeah, exactly. The 10 countries listed in this graph. And in 2013, 46% of international migrants resided in the US, just to show that the US really attracts a lot of immigrants. 11% in Russia, 10% in Germany, 9% in Saudi Arabia, and so on, okay? Just to show that really specific countries, they attract most of the immigrants from other places in the world. And this is another graph. In this case, in the previous graph, is just the overall number of international migrants living in those countries by those dates. So that's the stock of migrants in those dates. And in this other graph, you have information more about net migration, the annual net migration between 2010 and 2015 in thousands. So the US between 2010 and 2015 received 1 million more immigrants than lost immigrants per year between 2010 and 2015. So these countries here, they receive more people than they lose people. And these other countries in the bottom, they lose more people than they receive. And this is data again, per year between 2010 and 2015. And exactly because of the Syrian civil war, Syria has been losing around 720,000 of their population, more than what they receive per year within this time period, okay? And here again, an information about stock. People moved throughout the world for several decades, for several centuries. In 2013, what was the percentage of people that was foreign-born living in each one of these countries in the world? That's an information about stock. After these flows that happen through time, in that specific date, how many people were living there. And this information is in percentage terms. So in the countries in dark red, you have at least 10% of the population is composed by foreign-born people, orange between 1 and 9.9%, and yellow less than 1%. So this is this part about the basic concepts and definitions of internal migration. And here we go a little bit into the history of immigration in the world. I just want to show you here. Let's see if I can show. Yeah, today we just have Hannah in the classroom. You can see her back there somewhere. Oh no, you can just see her. Not even see her. Oh, there. Hi. I don't know if you want to be seen by the world now. Oh yeah, and I told you guys that I got my second shot of the coronavirus vaccine yesterday, and some people say that usually the second shot is really hard on us, but I'm all good. So those that are suspicious about it, it really depends on each person, right? And the history of international migration, I mean, the first modern humans began in sub-Saharan Africa about 195,000 years ago. And by 35,000 years ago, you had humans spread all over the world. In Eurasia, from France to Southeast Asia, and even Australia. So within this time period, between 195,000 years ago and 35,000 years ago, you had this mass movement of people, and they spread all over the world. And how modern humans went about colonizing these other drastically different environments during this intervening 160,000 years is still a not well-known history. Of course, we don't have data from that time. You have hypotheses of how this migration happened, but it's still open for discussion and for debate of how people spread all over the world, even with really low levels of technological development in those thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. The first international migration started to happen about 50 to 60,000 years ago. Humans began to migrate out of Africa, first to Southern Asia, China, Java, and later to Europe. Then they began migrating to the Americas around 14,000 years ago. And the movements were often through land areas and short sea routes, exactly because of the means of transportation that people had at that time that were really limited, right? So it's just you were able to migrate, but in a really slow process, and also usually going in shorter distances, little by little. After the first migrants, population flows to a new territory were usually preceded by an invasion of armies. So wars are a major way of people conquering other populations. So there is a lot of migration, international migration in those times as well. An example, even in centuries ago, could be found in the raiding activities by the Scandinavian pirates in England, Ireland, and France between 800 and 1066 AD. So several centuries ago, you had already the migration of Scandinavian Vikings and the Norse to in England, Ireland, and France, just to show that this movement of people across the world has been there for several years. International migrations and invasions could also involve the enslavement and forced migration of the defeated peoples to the land of their conquerors. So, for example, during the 5th century BC, Athens had about 75,000 to 150,000 slaves from both Africa and Asia. And these numbers represented about 25 to 35% of the Athens population. So the whole economy of Athens really depended on war, on these military actions that would later on enslave the population that lost the war, and they would work for them back in Athens. Transoceanic migrations, they started to happen after the 14th century. And these international migration invasions became, so people started to migrate across the oceans, and territorial exploration led by large naval expedition played a role in the dynamics of human migration to other parts of the unknown world. And just one indicator that kind of explains how exactly this migration was important, European immigrants as a share of the world population was only 3% back in 1750. But exactly because of these long distance migrations, they became 16% of immigrants in the world by 1930, because exactly Europeans migrating to other parts of the world, to the American continent, to Africa, and so on. The largest period of European overseas migration happened between 1840 and 1930, and 52 million people immigrated primarily to North America. And also before World War II, intercontinental migration from Asia was a little bit in a smaller scale, but it's already existed. So Asian Indians immigrated to British Guinea, East Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, and Trinidad. Japanese and Filipino migrants moved to Hawaii. Slavery in Brazil ended in 1888. Then the federal government started to create some programs to attract immigrants from other countries to work on coffee plantations. So that attracted, for example, the Japanese to Brazil. Chinese came to the US and worked a lot on the railroad and all other sorts of activities in the US before even World War II. Overall, in terms of magnitude, these flows here were not so big, but it's just to show that he already had this movement of people across countries happening even before World War II. The largest intercontinental slave migration recorded in human history happened between 1650 and the 1800s. Around 9.6 million enslaved Africans were brought to the New World involuntarily, and it can reach around 11 million if you counted those that died during the trip. So all these immigrants that the U.S. forced, immigration that the U.S. received, and also other countries in the American continent, added up to a lot of Africans being brought, again, involuntarily to be enslaved in the American continent. Overall, what are the consequences of these large migrations? There was a huge geographic redistribution of the global population. The pressures on the population on land and resources in Europe, for example, were relieved. So exactly because Europe, considering population density, had a high population considered to other areas, and then Europeans going to other countries relieved some of the population pressures on their resources. And birth and death rates were delayed in European countries with large immigration because those people moved to other areas, while birth rates were high in the destination countries. Usually immigrants in America, in the American continent, whenever I talk America, I'm talking about the whole continent, not just one country. People moving to the American continent, it's they were coming here to create in a really optimistic way, to have a new life, to have a new family. So their fertility rates were higher than the fertility rates of those that stayed back in Europe. So the population in the countries of destination increased a lot throughout those years, throughout that time. And we are talking here between 1650 to the 1800s. The geographic distribution of races has also changed dramatically, that's related to that information that I gave before. By 1930, about 1/3 of all whites no longer lived in Europe, and more than 1/5 of all blacks no longer lived in Africa. And since the 1930s, there have been several major international migration movements, and most migrants being refugees and asylum seekers. And you remember that we discussed early in this chapter that there are different categories of migrants. refugees, asylum seekers, migrants moving for economic reasons, the ones going to their former colony, and also the more privileged migrants from developed countries going to developing countries. But this latest more recent decades, since 1930s, most of the migrants moving between countries are related to pretty much like a involuntary migration due to issues of poverty, war. So those people are refugees and asylum seekers. During World War II, large numbers of Jews and political refugees left Germany. 20 million Eastern and Central Europeans were uprooted from their homelands between the rise to power of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s until the end of World War II. And by the end of the war, about 3 million Japanese were returned by decree to Japan from other Asian nations. Exactly those that had left, trying to conquer other places as well. And some other examples to show that these trends of international migration don't happen just from and to European countries. It happens across different countries in the world. After the partitioning of India in 1947 into India and Pakistan, more than 7 million Muslims fled from India to Pakistan, and a comparable number of Hindus moved from Pakistan to India. So you have like pretty much a rearrangement of the population moving from and to those countries. And still you have a lot of tension between India and Pakistan. And this story has been there for several years. In 1948, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from the territory that is now Israel. And even today, of course, a lot of them live as refugees in the Gaza Strip or in northern Egypt and other areas in the Middle East as well. And it has been like already generations and generations of Palestinians. In Southeast Asia, in the 1970s, millions of Southeast Asians were uprooted owing to political and economic disruptions. This resulted in one of the largest and most tragic refugee migrations in history. 10 million refugees migrated from what had been East Pakistan to northern India in 1971. So what is now Bangladesh, people moving to India. Subsequently, millions of Asians escaped from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos into Thailand and elsewhere. And there is, let me just, before I go to Afghanistan, and just because of Thailand here made me remember something. In our course website, there is here in the bottom, as you know, I have like several websites, external websites with data on demography. And there is this website here that has a map for migration flows, this world migration map. So this world migration map kind of shows migration all over the world. And this data is usually updated. So the latest data here, it's between 2010 and 2015. And if you click in each one of the countries, if you just pass the mouse here, you know, for example, the US received 3 million more people in this period than lost people. And if you click there, you see usually where are the countries that is receiving. But just if you go to Thailand here, it was like the slide that we just talked about, then you see that's a major receiving country in the area. They receive more, like they receive 600,000 more people that they lose people to other areas. And it's exactly from Myanmar, from Laos, from Cambodia, and from China as well. So just to show that there is a lot of migration going on in other parts of the world. And this map, I just think it's really interesting, that gives you in a really simple, dynamic way, information about these flows. Of course, this is not historical data. This is data just focusing in 2010 and 15, and it's always updated by this guy here, Galka Max. I don't know if it's Max is his first name. And he uses data from the UN Population Division. So it's just to show you that like these trends of migration between countries that we have been seeing for several decades, a lot of these movements still happen today. And then you can go there, like for example, in Syria, a lot of the population live in Syria, most of them are going to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and also northern Iraq, right? So it's just interesting to see these recent flows, and they are really related to how the historical flows happen in the past. Okay. And in the case of Afghanistan, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan generated massive numbers of refugees. There were about 6.5 million Afghan refugees between 88 and 91. And then another 5 million refugees left Afghanistan from the early 1990s to 2000. And by the early 2000s, about 1 in 4 Afghans were refugees. So pretty much 25% of people that were born in Afghanistan, they were living in another country by early 2000s. Just to show that all these invasions, all these wars change a lot the chances of people migrating from one country to the other. And the modern, and I mean, Afghanistan also has been affected afterwards by the invasion of the US after 2001. And so that issue of a lot of Afghans living in other countries persists even nowadays. The modern refugee era began at the end of Cold War, around 1991. Many developing countries were still engaged in violent conflicts after losing support from their superpower. Around 2001, there were 3.6 million Afghans found in Pakistan and Iran. So the economy in these countries of this nation really depends on the labor, in this case, really cheap labor from Afghans, and they have really bad conditions of life in those countries overall. In 2003, several million refugees fled Iraq due to the invasion by the US. So the wars that the US had, or still they are going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, they really make a huge impact in demographic components, not just mortality and fertility, but also migration. The United Nations High Commissions for Refugees, UNHCR, estimated that there were 46.3 million refugees in the world in 2014. Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan sent out the largest numbers of refugees. Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Turkey, and Jordan are the countries receiving the largest numbers, right? And that you can see a little bit on that graph that I just showed you. And another website that you can check some of this information specific about Syria, you can just go to the course website again, and United, let me just see. I think it's this resources about refugees. I think it's this one here. A snapshot of the crisis. They usually change the website. Let me see, it's this one here. Oops, wrong link. I have to update that link there, that's not working. Yeah, they changed some of these websites. They always change. There was a website here, cannot find it right now, that really showed where the Syrian refugees, because of the current civil war, they are located. And just these two. Maybe it was this website here. Let me just see really quick. If I cannot find it, I can talk to you afterwards. The asylum map. It doesn't show much. Yeah, this website here that's not working, that went into this page. I have to update it to take to this page here. That's the page that I wanted to show. So I just Google here and I found it. So this is like show that around 5.6 million Syrians left Syria, and that's data that was updated just now, April 14, 2021. Most of them are migrating to Turkey, but also a considerable amount to Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And here you also have this in a map format. But it's just to show you that because of being a major issue, you have this data specific about the conflict going on in Syria, right? And that's the exactly UNHCR on this link here that I will update in the website under this Syria regional refugee response, okay? Cool. Start here again. So there is like a lot of data there available, public available data about migration that you can try to understand specific issues in the world. And now focusing on immigration levels to the US, like looking at history of immigration to the US, around 98.5% of US residents are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. So remember in our previous class, when I was talking about first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, and third generation immigrants. When we talk about third generation immigrants, those are born in the US, their parents are born in the US, and their grandparents are born outside. Of course, they are all Americans and they have all the American culture, but they are descendant of immigrants in a relatively recent way because their grandparents might have been born in other countries. So that's 98.5% of the US population are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. In 2010, about 1.5% did not self-identify as immigrants or descendants of immigrants. So it's exactly which is only 4.2 million people. And who are those ones who don't identify themselves as being immigrants or descendants of immigrants? American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. Immigrants of other countries are mostly migrant workers and rarely become citizens. In other countries in the world, outside of the US, when people move to those countries, most of the people moving to those countries they can be refugees or they can be migrant workers as well. And they have really few opportunities to become citizens in the countries of destination. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, 84% of the population is foreign born. They really rely on immigration of people from countries around them to work on their oil industries. Migrants have restricted rights and they rarely have the chance to become permanent immigrants. The US, the story is a little different or completely different. The US receives most immigrants of all the countries in the world, as we saw in a previous graph, 46 million, and 14% of the US population is considered is foreign born. So this 98.5% here includes people who are foreign born or also descendants of immigrants. But if you just consider foreign born people, they are 14% of the US population. This fraction is smaller than 84% in the United Arab Emirates and also other percentages in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So if we think in terms of percentage of the population of the US that's foreign born, only 14% compared to 84% in the UAE. But here in the US, immigrants have a chance to become a citizens. If not themselves, at least their children, once they are born in the US, they automatically are American citizens. So in the US, it's a much more friendly country in terms of its laws to integrate immigrants, right? And also the American culture. There is a journalist in CNN, I think his name is Fareed Zakaria, and his family is originally from India, I think. But what is interesting from him, he was talking one day on his show, is that here in the US, we usually say, like, usually people who are against immigration say, oh, people who enter the US, they should learn English. They should learn the American culture. They should show that they like the US. But the reality is the opposite. The American culture, it's so positive perceived by immigrants that immigrants assimilate and integrate to the American culture in a much faster way than in other countries. The challenge of first-generation immigrants like me and like him is to actually try to teach a little bit of our original culture, in my case from Brazil, to my children, than actually trying to teach my children English or the American culture. Because the American culture is so welcoming to immigrants that they do learn and they do integrate really fast, right? So all this debate, we have to make sure that immigrants that come to the US will learn English, will learn the American culture. That already happens in a really natural way. And that's the integration of immigrants in the US is done in a much smoother ways than in other countries that have really restrictive rights and really difficult for these immigrants to become citizens. This is an overall trend of the number of immigrants and also immigrants as a percentage of the US population. The columns here are the absolute numbers, the number of immigrants, and the vertical axis on the left shows how many immigrants you have in the US, so around 42 million nowadays. And this is the percentage of the US population that is born outside of the US. Around 13% right now in the vertical axis on the right. So that's the immigrants as a share of the US population and the information percentage terms. Well, pretty much the same information, the same graph about the foreign-born population in the US. The previous one going from 1850 to 2013, 2012. And this one here going from 1860 to 2010. So this is the total foreign-born population, the left scale as well, and going around 40 million people. And then the percentage of the total population around 13%, right? So those are the overall numbers that we have around right now in the US, around 42 million foreign-born people living in the US, and they represent around 13% of the US population. The country of birth of immigrants to the US changed a lot throughout the centuries. We all know that. Most of the immigrants, they tend to be from Europe and the US, and in more recent years, they are from Latin America and Asia. So the character of US immigration changed since the mid-1800s. the origin locations of immigrants to the US have changed dramatically in these last centuries, in these last decades. In 1960, 75% of the US foreign-born population, they were from Europe. And in 2010, this percentage declined to only 12%. And this graph here, this map here, shows exactly these overall trends since 1820 until 2009. And here, just showing that back in the 1800s, most of immigrants, this is of course in absolute terms, they were from Europe, from Northwest Europe and also from the Southeast Europe, and fewer coming from Latin America, Asia, Africa. And in more recent decades, what you start to see is a drop in the overall number of immigrants coming from Europe and a huge increase on the number of immigrants coming from Latin America and also from Asia. Of course, the population in Asia being much bigger than Latin America, the absolute numbers are becoming really close to those from Latin America. But Latin America, it's easier for them to come to the US because of the geographical proximity. But what this table also shows is that the number of immigrants, foreign-born people in the US from Africa has been increasing a lot also in these last decades, right? So there is a shift on the origins of immigrants to the US, and this table simplifies that or summarizes that. And here you see overall this total number of immigrants from all these regions of the world, what's their percentage divided by the overall population in the US. So it was around 14% in the 1800s, and then it dropped, and it's now again around 13%, okay? So it's not really changing much of how it was before. And this graph here kind of shows the same information, but in this case from more recent years only, 1960 to 2010. So this is based on census data. And these numbers here, medians. Overall, in more recent years, around, again, 40 million people living in the US that were born in another country. But you see that in previous decades, most of them were from Europe. And then you start to see a decline of foreign-born people from Europe in the US in these more recent decades, and an increase of Latin Americans in the Caribbean, foreign-born population in the US, and also from Asia. Still, a similar thing, the annual number of legal US immigrants by decade in region of origin, 1960 to 69, 70, 80, 90, and 2000. And in previous decades, most of them coming from Europe. The colors in this graph were really not well chosen here. But the bottom ones here are the ones from Europe and Canada. Sorry. See, I'm confusing myself here. The one in the bottom that increased over time is from Latin America. Gray increased over time from Asia. And this light blue that decreased over time is Europe and Canada. So here should be light blue. I just copied this from this article here. And from other areas in the world, it increased from 1% to 10%. And this is the number of legal immigrants by decade, but per year coming to the US, okay? So that's a different kind of like information that we saw in the previous map, in the previous graphs and tables. This one here, this graph, I just went to this website by MPI, the Migration Policy Institute. Just saying, it's like really cool websites that you can look at this data. If you just go here, or MPI, Migration Policy Institute. This is still in our course website. Tool to generate graphs of countries of birth for US immigrants, 1960 present. So if you just open this one, you can select here any country that you want, country of birth of people that are now living in the US, right? So you can just select, and then it's gonna be added into your graph. So you have India, United Kingdom, Venezuela, Brazil, and you can also add, let's add Mexico. And of course, when you add Mexico, the scale here changes a lot, and the other ones you start to see that compared to Mexicans in the US, these other countries have much lower share of the population. So I just use this website here to generate these slides that I'm going to show now. And exactly because of what you just saw here, when I added Mexico, the scale here in the vertical axis changed because they are the biggest population in terms of like foreign-born people in the US. That all the graphs that I'm going to show you here, they include Mexico across these different slides here. So just because then we can compare these slides because they keep the same scale. So it was just like a little trick that I used here to be able to compare the overall level of these slides that I'm going to show you for different countries. But of course, you don't have to select Mexico for all of them. In more recent years, we have been hearing a lot about migration from Northern Central America, and mostly from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And these countries are, so they have been coming a lot of immigrants from these countries, and a lot of them are trying to apply for our asylum seekers or refugees because of a lot of issues of poverty and poverty, violence, and drug issues of like drug wars in those countries, and people try to come to the US. And we also have been hearing since 2014 that these countries, exactly because parents, they might not be successful entering the US, they send their children by themselves. That's what another issue that we have been talking for a while already about unaccompanied children coming to the US from Central America. So these countries are North Central America. Also, they're known as the Northern Triangle. I don't think they like to be called that, but they are the North Central America. But even if you look at this increase in the number of immigrants that are now from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador living here in the US, the overall numbers, of course, it's much lower compared to people born in Mexico. Exactly because migration from Mexico has been happening for several more years than from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Selecting Asian countries, China and India, we have been seeing an increase in the migration from China and India to the US, but still the overall number of people born in China and India that live in the US, it's still much lower than in Mexico, but you see that in Mexico is actually decreasing in more recent years. And this is information about the stock, right? After all these years of migration, what do we see in 1960, 1965, and 1970? And an interesting thing that Dudley Poston, he discusses throughout his textbook, is that one of his main hypotheses for the US in these next decades is that the migration from Mexico to the US has been declining over time. And now there are more Mexicans going back to the US than entering the US. So if you look at the flow, not the stock, you actually have more Mexicans going back to Mexico than coming to the US. And a lot of these immigrants from China or even from India, they are low educated immigrants, they have low skill, And the main hypothesis of Dudley Poston is that those low-skilled immigrants from China will replace the low-skilled immigrants from Latin America, more specifically from Mexico. So that's a hypothesis that he has been discussing for several years, and that's something that we might see in this next decade. Here selecting immigrants from Canada, Germany, and the UK. Again, I'm just leaving Mexico here in all the graphs. So we have a similar scale in all these graphs. And then you see that the overall number of people in the US that were born in Canada, Germany, and United Kingdom actually has been declining or being really stable over time. So you don't really see major trends there. And if you, we looked at that other table, kind of showing that the number of immigrants or foreign-born people from Africa has been increasing a lot in the US in these last decades. In here, I just selected Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Specifically, I was doing work in a research project about immigrants from those 4 countries because they are countries located in West Africa, and they are all English-speaking countries. So technically, these people from Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone would have a better integration to the American culture because of being English speakers. But even though we saw in that previous graph that the previous map, the previous table, this table here, that the number of immigrants from Africa have been increasing over time, in this graph, we see that these numbers are still really small to produce overall change compared to the number of foreign-born people from Mexico in the US. But in our specific project, at the end, we focus only on Nigerian immigrants because the Nigerian immigrants have a huge self-selection there, usually really well-educated, and people with higher socioeconomic status move from Nigeria to the US. And they're their children, when they are born here, so the children of Nigerian immigrants, people born in Nigeria, come to the US, and they have a higher percentage of them with really high levels of education and income. When they enter the US, they have children, and their children do really well compared to even non-Hispanic white population, and even compared to Asians. Right? The case of Liberians in Sierra Leone and people from Sierra Leone is different because those countries are poorer than Nigeria, and their immigrants, when they come to the US, they have already worse socioeconomic conditions compared to Nigerian immigrants. So that paper that we just got it published this year kind of show that for this specific group here, it's not a big numbers of people, but if we look at this specific group here, among African immigrants, recent African immigrants to the US, their children of Nigerians are doing well in the country, right? So it's just, whenever we talk about these major groups, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic African Americans, non-Hispanic Asians, Hispanics, and Native Americans, we usually group them in these large race ethnicity groups. But if we look at the story of each one of them, they might give us some interesting insight about the integration process. And in this case, it's just showing that Nigerian immigrants, there's a really high self-selection. They enter here already with really good levels of education and income, so their children do really well. So that was data from the Migration Policy Institute, MPI. And they usually have really interesting articles being published there about recent trends of immigration in the US. And actually, I wrote an article to them a while ago about trends of immigration to Brazil. So they also do analysis about migration to other countries as well. This is breaking down the foreign-born population in the US by country of birth. The countries that have the highest numbers representing the US. Mexicans 11.7 million, which represents 29% of the all foreign-born population in the US. So out of all people that were not born in the US, almost 30% of them are Mexicans, based on data from 2010. 2.2 million from China, 1.8 from India, and these represent 5 and 4% of the foreign-born population in the US. Okay. Immigration has a major effect on the size, distribution, and composition of the US population because fertility and mortality are relatively low in the country nowadays. As we talked about the demographic transition theory, you first saw a decline of mortality, and then afterwards you saw a decline in fertility. Still, you have oscillations in mortality and fertility, as we have been talking through this semester, but the levels of fertility and mortality are really low. So the major effects in terms of population growth, population distribution of where people are moving to, and composition of the US population in terms of race and ethnicity is mostly driven by the patterns of immigration. And I also saw by the end of the previous chapter about internal migration within the US that the distribution of people within the US vary by nativity, vary by whether they are born in the US or not, and also vary by race ethnicity. So both international migration and internal migration, they have a major effect on the geographic distribution of the US population, right? Immigration's roles in the growth of the US population has increased, exactly because fertility and mortality are not so strong anymore. Immigration contributed to around 30% of the total population increase between 1980 and 2000. And the number of foreign-born US residents rose from 14 million in 1980 to 36 million in 2005. And we saw in the previous graphs and tables to around 42 million in more recent years. But the overall percentage of the foreign-born population in the US kind of stable around 13%. And in this case here, just a table, again, from another source, not from the textbook. There is an increase in the US born and foreign born population between 1980 and 2005. So this is the overall population in the US, increasing from 227 million in 1980 and reaching 288 in 2005. And the US born population increased from 213 to 253 million. The foreign born, as I mentioned in the previous slide here, from 14 to 36, exactly these numbers here. The percentage increase of this population, the overall population, was from like 9.8% between 1980 and 1990 and 13% in 1990 and 2000. The US born population increased in this period from 7.7% from 80 to 90 and 9.3%. But this increase here for the foreign-born population was much more significant. 40% between 1980 and 1990, and 55% between 1990 and 2000. And the foreign-born share of increase between 1980 and 2000 is still lower than the US population, because still the US born population is much bigger than the foreign born. So you still have like the share of increase of the US born population is higher compared to the foreign born. But these guys here increased a lot in these last decades. And we have been seeing that now you have a trend of increasing immigration from Asian and African countries, still lower in absolute numbers than from Mexico, for example, but the trend has been increasing over time. This is the foreign-born population by state, and the percentage of the state population that is born in another country. So you have Texas, Nevada, California, Florida, New York, with at least 15% of the population born in another country. And some other countries, some other states, between 10% and 14.9% of the population born in another country, right? So that's just to show that also specific states in the US, they attract more immigrants than other states, as we know. But this kind of data here summarizes that, and that's information from 2005. So you see here, for example, that California, Nevada, Texas, Florida, and, New York, and New Jersey have really high percent of the state population born in another country. But when you look, so this is the overall stock of the population in those states born in another country, the stock in 2005. But if you look at the flow from 2000 to 2005, and then compare the number of foreign-born people in these states at the beginning and the end of the period to estimate the percentage growth, you see exactly that those states here that overall don't have really high percentage of foreign-born population, but the overall percentage of foreign-born population in those states have been increasing in this period. So you see the southern states here with a percent increase in foreign-born population higher, at least a percent increase of 35% or higher. So these two maps here are interesting because here we get this stock in 2005, but then we see that there are some trends in these other states of recent increases in foreign-born population. This is also related to migration flow between 2003 and 2015. What's the number of legal immigrants flowing to each state between those years, and the ones receiving more, New York, Florida, and California, but also Texas with high numbers. And the migration stock after the whole history of the US right now, or right in this year here, 2012, what's the percentage of the population that's foreign-born? And again, you see states closer to the southern border here, and then Florida, and New York, and New Jersey having really high percentage of the population born in another country. And here, doing some projections of the population in terms of nativity, the Census Bureau projections point to continued increases in foreign-born population in the next decades. By 2060, the foreign-born proportion is expected to reach to nearly 20% of the population. So from around 13, 14% now to 20%. And the non-Hispanic whites will have fallen to less than 50% of the population. So we will reach this composition in the US that some demographers call it a majority-minority country. If you put all minority groups together, they will be more than 50% of the US population. And most immigrants are from Latin America and Asia. I already discussed with you here in previous classes that this term here, majority-minority population, is controversial because we are putting together a lot of people with different experiences in the US. We are putting everybody who don't classify themselves as being solely non-Hispanic whites. You put then the non-Hispanic whites in one group and the other ones in another group. And these other ones, they're expected to be more than 50% of the population. But some of those could also be whites, but they also self-classified as another race. And those people, maybe they have the same level of integration into the American society as non-Hispanic whites, but artificially we are putting them in two different groups. And I just gave you an example of recent immigrants from Nigeria, that their children, when they are born in the US, they are doing really well in terms of education and earnings. So that specific subgroup, Nigerians, within African Americans in the US, they are doing better than the overall group of African Americans. So whenever we put together all these minority groups and say that they will be more than 50% of the population, what is this important for us? You should say that there is an increase in diversity in the country. There is a book by that same demographer that gave that NPR interview, William Frey, called Diversity Explosion, that he's pretty much talking about that, of how the country now has more people from other race ethnicity groups, not only non-Hispanic whites. But just this information, by saying that non-Hispanic whites would be less than 50%, doesn't consider the huge diversity that exists between these minority groups, right? So it's just, we have to be careful when using this term. Whenever I use this term majority minority population in the US, I try to emphasize this. I open this long parenthesis to kind of say that that can be controversial. An estimated 11 million persons are undocumented in the US, about 25% of the current foreign-born population. And annual deportations from this group have approached or exceeded around 400,000 people being sent back to their home countries. And here is just the US population by race ethnicity group. So the US population back in 1970 had an 83% of non-Hispanic white, and then it declined to 52, and we expect to decline lower than 50% these next decades by 2060, according to these specific projections of the Census Bureau. The percentage of the non-Hispanic African American population has been kind of stable over time, around 13%. What has been increasing a lot is the share of the Hispanic population, but also of the non-Hispanic Asian population, right? And other groups as well. But again, the Hispanic population is really heterogeneous within itself. The same thing about Hispanics, and the same thing about whites as well. These major classifications lose a lot of details about this population. And in terms of integration, that I was talking to you guys, how integration of immigrants in the US, they are much faster, and we are much more optimistic about this integration of immigrants in the US compared to other countries. But there is a lot of variation among different immigrant groups, right? Many migrants from Mexico and Central America enter the US with low levels of education and also with really little English proficiency. And children of migrants are seen to have converged substantially to the native-born averages in a broad array of domains. So some people from Mexico and Central America in general, when they come here, they tend to have lower levels of education and little English proficiency, but then their children improve a lot because they go to the public schools in the US, they reach higher levels of education compared to their parents. And that affects in a positive way their earnings, occupation. They have lower levels of poverty, higher levels of residential integration, and they all know English, right, really well. But something that I mentioned in the previous class too, integration also produced declines in well-being. Children of immigrants, when they integrate to American society and have the health habits and really bad diet of fast food and everything, that affects in a negative way their health. Children of immigrants, in terms of the likelihood of committing crime, are much more likely to have the same levels as the US-born population compared to their parents. So my children, when they reach 20 years of age, their chances of committing a crime will be higher than mine when I was at that age, and their chance of committing crime is going to be as high as the US-born population. So it's pretty much showing that integration happens in positive ways and in negative ways, because here they are reaching the same levels of health, crime, and family stability as the overall US-born population. In this overall integration with the native-born white population is fastest for Asian immigrants, slower for Latinos, is the slowest still among African Americans, and especially difficult for undocumented individuals because they cannot get basic access to, even some states, to driver's license and stuff like that, and to good jobs, right? So I will continue to talk about this integration and these characteristics of immigrants broken down by different subgroups in the next class. And we have pretty much only 2 lectures left on Tuesday and Thursday. The quiz 16 is open now. On Tuesday, we're going to have quiz 17. And then on Thursday, we don't have a quiz because that's the assignment 3, which is already posted in the course website. Okay, and then we have the final in the following Tuesday. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday.